Welcome to our series called Six Sacred Stones in Regenerative Growing in the Southwest. My name is James Skeet. I'm a Navajo, or from the Dene tribe. My clan is Red Cheek, born of Leaning Tower. My wife is Joyce Skeet from the state of Pennsylvania. So this first principle or stone that we talk about is about water. Why is water so sacred to indigenous people? They even compartmentalize or stratify the father sky, the compost, and then the under earth, the seas. All of them are strata layers, and all these characters that are involved in that are microbes, are fishes, are beavers, or otters, or things of the air. So those things are all a part of this interpretation of the cosmology. Joyce, you want to talk a little bit about the female and male archetypes within indigenous worldviews?
So nature presents itself in forms of patterns. Plants, animals, and all creation itself understands and follows these patterns. Some examples of patterns we find are in the sky and in the earth. And like James said, indigenous people refer to the sky as father sky because it carries the male attributes. The atmosphere is like a covering and a protection layer. The stars, they're there to guide. And when you look up, you see the expanse. It's like visionary. And then earth, they refer to earth as Mother Earth because it's very nurturing and it gives birth. James used to tell me when I first came out here, he would take me for a walk on the land in the spring, and he said, be careful where you walk because Mother Earth, she's pregnant with life. And so that was a whole new concept to me. For earth, you are always looking down to see the details of life that are growing, and we want to enjoy those precious things that Mother Earth is growing for us. We often refer to rain as female rains and male rains. Male rains are the hard, strong rains, female, the soft, gentle rains. It's our human mind that struggles with this pattern because it's become so linear. But when you really get into regenerative agriculture, true regenerative agriculture understands the importance of following these patterns. And you'll often hear them say to mimic nature. Some of the most important parts of mimicking nature is just watching how the animals and how the plants, how they function. And if we actually take the time to watch and observe and to really listen, try to listen to nature, we will learn a lot. These two archetypes, the male and female, sky and earth, they work together, and they have to work together. They can't work separately. A lot of times Father Sky isn't even referred to. It's you'll hear Mother Earth more often than you even hear Father Sky. But Father Sky is just as important to healing the earth and reversing global warming. And water is life. Father Sky holds that key to the water.
When we talk about sacredness and that relationship with all these different archetypes, a lot of it is really a change in behavior. And that change in behavior from an indigenous perspective is really, really important. We don't scold or we don't directly confront. What we do is we talk in stories, we tell stories. We use examples of animals on how we need to have a better focus on that behavioral change, our character. Part of the ceremonies also is to celebrate and to connect and to mimic Mother Nature in those patterns. Black Elk Speaks often talks about in that book, shadow casting, how the physical and the spiritual, because of dual Platonic thought, has separated the two realms. But to indigenous people, all of it really runs together. So a lot of what you're shadowing is the ceremonies, but the real essence is the spirituality. So part of that understanding, that sacredness, that ethical base, which science has disemboweled itself from, it doesn't even allow that whole perspective to be within science. Then they compartmentalize and they separate the two. So if you look to science for any kind of behavioral change or ethical change, it's not going to happen because it doesn't really take into consideration the really defined, specific expression of this cosmology. And the cosmology really means the layering, whether it's a rites of passage or whether it's a male or female, fire, water. All these things are really just essence of a much larger mystery, the great mystery we call. So it is really important to incorporate this indigenous cosmology into a balance of science. And one of the things that we try and work really hard to do is how to not make science the end product, but how do we incorporate it as a means along with our indigenous cosmological perspective? How do we become inclusive? A lot of what's happening in growing is monocropping, just one plant or just one thing or just one amendment. And then what we have is just a really confused state of what the soil is. So one of the things we try to do is polycrop. Isn't that kind of funny that most of our culture, we've become polarized so much so that we are not really mimicking Mother Nature in terms of polyculture. We're monoculture. I really think that we unit everything, we compartmentalize, we make it mechanical, and we specialize certain people to certain jobs where a lot of people no longer farm. They don't really know how animals are kept or how things are grown. So one of the very first basis stones that we really try to define, and the Navajos call it Tatopa Hahasen, which means rainwater is very, very sacred and precious. So the implication of this water cycle is a pattern that we need to look at, and we've not done very well in these last couple of years. In fact, we've contaminated the atmosphere so much because we're detached from that. We think it's expendable, and it's not. A lot of what we're seeing today is the generations of abuse, the misuse of what Mother Nature and the great mystery has presented.
Most of us take water for granted. Like, for instance, when we flush a toilet, the regular toilets that you buy and most of us use, it takes from the time we flush it to the time it's processed and filled back up, it takes every flush about 10 gallons. And when you think about that, that's a tremendous amount of water that we are using and wasting. Here in the Southwest, water has become so precious. And for us at our demonstration farm, we have to haul water for our house, for our animals, and for our plants. And we've learned really how to use water to build that capacity of using water and how to save water. We're noticing wells drying up. We're noticing longer lines where we go to get our water. We're learning how to not take water for granted. Some things we're really learning how to do is how do you use the runoff water from the land? Building swales, check dams, berms, and redirecting water that falls. The water that is not going down into the earth, we're collecting that and rerouting it to different areas of our farm. Also, how do we reuse water from our house? Setting up gray water systems, using water a second time that comes into our house. We were out on the reservation doing a compost workshop at a home, and we needed some water. And one of the gentlemen went and got a bucket, and the little 5-year-old granddaughter was really adamant, no, you can't have that bucket. That bucket's to collect the rainwater. And when we looked, there was 5-gallon buckets lined up right under the edge of the house, of the roof, so that it could collect all that rainwater. And she understood the sacredness of water. She understood how important it was to save water. Back in the early 1900s, the Navajos, they knew how to save water and use water really conservatively. They could wash all their dishes with 1 cup of water. And for us to even think about that or comprehend that is, we don't even know where to start. Our second sacred stone is to minimize the soil disturbance. During this first sacred stone of saving water, we want to be able to move the soils now. We want to be able to move the soil so that we can create the swales and the berms and the check dams now before we start into the sacred stone so that we don't have to disturb the soil anymore later on. So rerouting water, we want to work on that right now.
Our behavior really reflects what's really in our hearts. I really do believe that. The water cycle implication, we need to get that biotic pump going again. So what's happening over the Southwest and a lot of the desertification, it's called. Alan Savory talks a lot about that, and other folks that are land managers, holistic management. They're really looking at a much larger scale and problem that we have. You hear of all the fires that are going on in Australia and in California. It's because that pump is broken in the atmosphere. A lot of the microbial sponge, the sponge that is really related to compost, these bugs have certain charges and they work with the atmospheric charges. And it's a very complex system to try to understand. And there are scientists really looking at that. What happens is almost a dry dome over a certain area. So whenever moisture comes in, it either goes around or doesn't penetrate that dome. So this biotic pump really needs to be reestablished if you look at the bottom line of why that pump is broken is because of the microbial activity in the soil. So when you don't have microbial activity, desertification is taking place. What you have is really compacted ground where water cannot even penetrate. Or what happens to the groundwater is that a lot of these fissures, they go down these cracks and fissures underground. And what happens to that is a lot of mineralization. So when you do pump that up into the surface, you get this really hard layer, hard cake on top of the soil as you try to put water on top of the ground. So there's a lot happening, and we see is really a result of how we have mistreated and how we have not really reconnected with the water systems and how these water systems are now working against us. I think Mother Nature is going to continue to live, but whether or not we're going to be on this earth to exist with it is a different story. We've started some discussions and conversations regarding water systems, but that's really our first stone that we have to hit. Are we sequestering water? Are we capturing water? What's our soil like? Is it compacted? How do we get those gaps in there, aggregates in the soil so that water can penetrate? What kind of soil do we have? Do we have loamy soil? Do we have sand? There's a lot of things to look at. Do we need to mulch? Do we need to run irrigation drip lines, or do we need to spray? What about irrigation? All those things are not in our discussion, but I know that there's a lot of folks trying things and doing things. In this series, we really want to just help Indigenous people reimagine themselves in the context of where they're at presently and the migration back to center of helping people to begin to garden again, to begin to make compost, to view water as being very sacred. How do we imitate Mother Nature, and how do we follow the ancient rhythms? So on Spirit Farm, we have mainly focused on demonstrating these concepts. We know we can't manage land, but we can manage ourselves on the land. What we do every day as we walk out into our farm is where do we need to focus our energy? And how do we partner with Mother Nature so that things grow optimally and also with high levels of nutrient density?
If you want to find more information about our farm and our nonprofit and what we are all about, you can visit our website at covenantpathways.org. We really appreciate your time today. Our next podcast will be on minimizing soil disturbance.